that bees are not dying off in this country, nor the rest of the world, but they are dying off. This presentation is titled Honeybees Talk.
All right, here we go. During the presentation, I have 3 different types of honeys that we're going to get to taste. So I'm going to start passing around some spoons. You just need 1 spoon for all the 3 things. One of them is going to be an international type honey that's going to be a blend of honeys from all over the world, usually 3 to 5 different countries. So when you look at this honey at the store, when you're buying it, it'll say product of Uruguay, Spain, Brazil, might say Poland, and might say USA. Another type of honey that you're going to taste is going to be a U.S. commercially produced honey. So usually this honey will be a little bit more expensive, and it's going to say product of USA. Here we're looking at a price point between 25 and 50 cents an ounce. The international honey will run about 18 to 28 cents an ounce. That usually comes in big 4-pound jugs or bigger. And then you'll taste our honey, the honey that we produce, that starts selling at $2 an ounce. So 4 to 5 times as much as the other ones. And we'll explain through why our honey sells for much higher, why we sell out of honey every year, and why people continue to purchase our honey. To begin with, we're awful close to Groundhog Day, right? How many of you think we're going to have a much longer winter? So everyone's predicting an early spring, I see. Well, that's not what the bees say. And we'll see on February 2nd what the beaver says, or whatever he is. But I love this because, you must always be willing to truly consider, evidence that contradicts your beliefs and admit the possibility that you and the experts might be wrong. And that's kind of why I'm here. I am here to present the case that you, as farmers, are the future beekeepers. That the commercial beekeeper that is tending to the bee populations in the U.S. is going to go extinct. And I'm going to help make sure that happens. The first honey that's going to go around. Have a little taste as much as you want, and we'll tell you which one is which at the end of the show here. Why commercial beekeepers? The first kind of piece of evidence of why farmers need to have honeybees. This is a picture of Kansas, Deerfield, Kansas, about an hour west of here. September 11th, 1936. Who was around on that day and remembers what was happening on that day? None of you, right? But what was happening at this time in this area? 1936 was the height of the Dust Bowl in this area. And here you have a farmer, the Benthrops, who is turning in 17,000 pounds. Is that what it says? Yep. 17,400 pounds of alfalfa seed. So we're having farmers that are going bankrupt, losing their farms, getting everything taken from them. And then you've got farmers that are harnessing the power of pollinators and honeybees, turning in whopping crops of alfalfa seed for sale. You can see, bees and pollinators are going to devastate you, or they're going to help you, supercharge your farming operations. Whether you're producing seed for yourself, for somebody else, or you're producing bulk volume as far as forage. Another reason why farmers are going to be the commercial beekeepers in the future. Every year we lose more and more. We see more consolidation in the bulk honey producers market. Kansas is home to the largest honey producer or honey packager in the U.S. now. There used to be 3. We're down to just these guys here in Hillsboro, and there's another startup company kind of starting in Texas. But people are becoming more afraid and more leery to be purchasing from these large corporations because there's no transparency, right? The story of how this company started is a beautiful story, but that was 50 years ago. the people that started this company are no longer around or in charge. So there's not that belief that there was once. Now, the story of you keeping bees on your farm, that's a fresh story. That's a fresh start. That's somewhere that people can come and see what you're doing. So the loss of maybe trust in mega corporations and people wanting to know where food comes from. Honeybees by the numbers. At one point in the 1980s, we had 47,000 honeybees here in Kansas. We're down to about 5,000 commercially kept beehives. Kansas used to produce a lot of alfalfa seed in Larned kind of area. We had one producer who's still around now, who's in his mid-70s. He had 13,000 hives just by himself in this whole area, and he would overwinter his bees in Texas. But, when we were convinced that it was cheaper to buy our alfalfa seed from producers that now made it in Oregon and Washington, we exported, what once was, a great product that produced here, the Kansas common alfalfa seed. So what am I proposing? That farmers, that you control the habitat. You control what is planted. And you can benefit from bees by increasing yields in your gardens, starting seeds for the next years, increasing the diversity in your backyards, and diversify your revenue in honey sales. By bringing in honeybees into your operation, because you're already working on soil health, on introducing living roots, you're going to have blooms, more often throughout the year. Why not harness those blooms by producing a secondary crop that comes from those blooms? And bees can help you do that. So let's look at why the bee industry is failing. So this is according to me. I used to be a commercial beekeeper, keeping bees conventionally. So some of these pictures that you're going to see are things that I used to do, and why it made me change, completely shift, and why I see how these people are going to go out of business. These beekeepers provide boxes, but they can't provide habitat. These commercial beekeepers are keeping bees in boxes that are inferior, that are not designed, for overwintering bees in harsh environments. These are single-walled hives that are no more than 3/4 of an inch thick, and we're expecting bees to live in these things in winter conditions, like we have here in the Midwest and the North. You can see in both of these pictures, over here we've got, we do have one monoculture crop. So these bees are going to be fed, nectar and pollen from that crop. But it's one food. If I stuffed you guys into this room and all I did was feed you Hershey bars for the whole winter, you guys will survive. By the time, spring comes around, all of you would still be alive. But you might be diabetic. You're going to be, you're not going to have proper nutrition. You're going to be deficient in many things. And I might not be able to tell you, let's get to work. I'm going to have to supercharge feed you with something else because I've been feeding you just one thing, right? In this other instance, how many blooms do you see around all these beehives? That's a desert. So we're taking these bees out to deserts and providing them no food. I mean, this is the reality of commercial beekeeping. If there's nothing good coming in to something, we cannot have a good end product if there's only one product going in. So all of this is being supplemented in different ways, in artificial ways. Instead of having no pollen available, the commercial beekeeper's response is we'll give them pollen. And not pollen, but pollen substitute. Pollen substitute is made out of soy lecithin, egg yolk, brewer's yeast, high fructose corn syrup, and essential oils. That's not pollen. It might have the same raw materials that we as humans, think comes from pollen, but it's dead. This is a sterile food that we're feeding our animals, right? So this is an input. This is the fertilizer that you guys are using or no longer using or trying not to use on your fields. This is how beekeepers fertilize their bees to feed them. This is what they're doing. They're taking these pollen and they're making these slurry, cow pies out of them, mixing sugar syrup into them, because you saw where they were keeping them. There was no food to be had anywhere. So they have to feed their animals something. So this is their solution. Because the beekeepers themselves, the commercial beekeepers, don't own any land. They don't own planters. They don't know where to buy seed. They don't know how to grow seed. They just show up with bees and expect you guys to have the blooms for them. So this is the reality. All of this stuff that goes into the hive somehow expresses itself in the honey that you eat. So just like if you were to, heavily vaccinate, heavily feed an animal something that is not good for humans, but it's going to be processed through the animal, it will express itself in the final product. Lack of resources. When we have commercial beekeeping operations like this, when they do honey harvesting, they tend to over-harvest. So they take everything that the bees were able to manage to bring in, and they'll replenish it with something that's other than honey. So honeybees do not make honey for humans. They make honey for themselves, and we just steal it. And this is how they replace the honey. They will go through and replace all of the nectar that the bees have collected, and they'll mix up sugar syrup and bake it into cakes and feed it back to the bees. Why? Because there's not enough blooms. You saw the picture of the desert that was around them. So we have figured out how to feed the bees a sterile supplement to get them through to the next bloom. Because these beekeepers don't know how to keep a living root. They don't know how to have continuous blooms. And this is the only thing they can do to keep their bees alive. Just like having deficient soils. We might have to be adding amendments. We might have to be adding fertilizers. We might have to be adding things just to make sure that our crop will make it. And that's when we're not even talking about the pesticides that we have to put into the hive to deal with a disease that might be inside the hive. What does this picture look a lot like? A feedlot, right? And many of you are no longer finishing your cattle on feedlot or realize that there is a demand for something, for a product that doesn't come out like this. And this is where we can put in the medicines. This is where we can go to a vet and say, look, our bees have dysentery because we've overfed them sugar syrup that we're going to have to put bleach solution into so it doesn't go rancid. And now our bees have dysentery, we need antibiotics. They'll get a prescription for antibiotics, and this is the mode of how we can give antibiotics to our bees. And this is ending up in our honey. Our children and people are now becoming allergic to some of these commercial honeys because all these inputs are expressing themselves in the honey. You can see we have all these big rig, sugar syrup, ways to feed our bees. Everything you see in the background, when I say to be a successful beekeeper, you need to have color for your bees. This is how you feed your bees, by having color. And when I say color, I mean color other than green. You can see in all these commercial beekeeping pictures, all you see is greenscapes. There's no blooms in green. I don't know of any bloom that is green that is productive. When I mean color, I mean you need whites, yellows, oranges, blues, purples. If you have those colors in your fields, you can create real food, real honey. The bees can't be getting nectar from grasses. There's no nectar to be had from wheat, right? So does that kind of make sense? When we're looking at, can I keep bees, I need to be looking at my landscape. Is it a greenscape? Do I have the colors? Or what colors can I add to my cover crops to make sure those colors are up so that I can harness the power of those blooms? Once again, look at this greenscape. There is no color here. The only thing yellow is that forklift, right? This is how commercial beekeepers feed their bees. And you can order up tankers of high fructose corn syrup that they can feed them. But now people are catching up to the idea that there's high fructose corn syrup in the honey because of the allergies that they're developing. So now beekeepers have figured out how to demand tanker trucks of glucose, of synthetic glucose, and the manufacturing company is like, okay, you want glucose? We'll make you synthetic glucose. So now they can advertise no high fructose corn syrup used in our operations. So where there's a willing buyer, there's somebody willing to manufacture something synthetic to replace it. How do I know it ends up in the honey? Most people are highly allergic to high fructose corn syrup. I was one of those people at one point. And I was trying to figure out, I got into beekeeping to get away from refined sugars. I thought, well, I'll just start keeping bees for myself again. But I was still having those problems because I was keeping the bees the way I was told, by feeding them sugar syrup, by feeding them all these bee supplements that contain high fructose corn syrup, and I was still having hives. But I didn't understand why, because when I put in a clear liquid that's sugar syrup into a beehive, I can't follow it to the bottle. So I started doing experiments. I started taking beehives and I started putting in the food coloring that comes in the baking packets. So I had one hive that had an internal hive feeder that had the blue, and one the red, and one the yellow, and one the orange. Within a couple of weeks, all my beehives had every single color, even though the feeder was inside. Beehives work just like plants. There was an incredible amount of exchange of information and resources between all the beehives. All these beehives were realizing I was putting poison, liquid poison, in their hives, and they all shared the burden of spreading it between all of them. Because we know that sugar is poison to humans. Yet, we think it's okay to feed it to our bees and expect them to be magicians and turn it into honey for us. So when we were extracting all of the honey, these were test things that I was doing, because I was like, how am I still allergic to something that's supposed to be pure? It was coming out as green honey as all the different colors mixed together. Now, this was a big problem, because as soon as people found out, and they're like, I'll buy your green honey, and I'm like, no, like, you're missing the point. Like, this is not honey, this is sugar syrup. And they're like, I'll buy the sugar syrup, it's green, like, I've never seen it. I'm like, so we have to be careful, and that was not my goal, if that kind of makes sense. But this is the only way that I could track from land to table, from farm to table, that I could track my inputs through a beehive. But nobody will tell you this. I have this food coloring challenge that I challenge every beekeeper that does this now, and not one beekeeper will take me up on this challenge. I said, put food grade food coloring in your sugar syrup and follow it to your bottle, because they're afraid. They're petrified that it is getting in there. Scary, huh? The transportation issue. Migratory beekeepers will not be in business in the future because their whole business relies on moving, trucking 2.7 million hives throughout the whole U.S., because we as farmers have created perfect monocultures of apples, cranberries, raspberries in the north, blueberries, cranberries in the, on the northeast, cucumbers, citrus down in the south. But all these huge monoculture operations, they don't have time or the expertise to run honeybees. So what do? They created this market of migratory beekeepers. And they travel throughout the whole world. As diesel prices go up, transportation costs are going to go up, and the cost to hire bees is going to go up. Eventually, farmers are going to be like, well, we can't do this anymore. That's too high of a price. So that will end. Also, the cost of sugar might be low right now, but there was a time during COVID where there were shortages in sugar, and sugar prices went up, and that's where beekeepers were freaking out trying to figure out alternatives of what to feed to them. but you guys can feed pollen and nectar in the form of flowers. So you guys are the rightful owners and keepers of the bees in the future. If you don't get on board with this now, by the time you're going to want to get onto the bee train, it's going to be too late. You're going to have people way ahead of you producing a product. You know, this transportation issue, it's just, the costs are just going to keep going up. And to be able to to keep these monocultures of bees moving, the costs are going to be too high. Many times you've probably seen beehives with little things on the top. These are external feeders. You know, to somebody who doesn't know what this is, they're feeding sugar syrup. If you're buying local honey from local beekeepers, and you go to their places and you see these things, that's poison they're feeding their bees that's going to end up in your honey. When you see these things, that's a bad thing. When you ask them, and look at these greenscapes, right? There's no blooms on those plants, on those trees, and everything else underneath is green. Everything here is green, grasses. There's no blooms. The blooms are in the jars. This is the only alternative they have to make sure their livestock is alive. You've probably been there with crops, where a crop consultant is telling you the only way you're going to save this crop is if you add this, like yesterday. Or the only way you're going to save this crop is if you spray this, like today, right? So beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, have all their eggs in one basket, and they're forced to do this because they'll lose everything if they don't. So this is why they will go out of business. They have lack of continuous forage. They're overwintering. They're not having the right resources available. Maybe not even the right boxes. They're using migratory boxes that are not meant to be stationary and in harsher environments. I'm going to pass around the second honey now.
It's just so fascinating, so complex, and it mostly works until we get in the way of it.
Populations of honeybees are dying at levels that are unprecedented and very concerning. Close to half of the colonies in the U.S. dying every single year.
Many colonies have disappeared, and farming has become a lot bigger, and so due to all this, now we need beekeepers that can move bees from one place to the other.
We can learn a good deal from bees about the health of the landscapes that we inhabit, and we can learn a good deal about the folly of setting up our agriculture in quite the way that we have.
Agriculture is an interruption of a natural system, but it can be done thoughtfully as an interruption of a natural system with great benefits.
It's going to take 20, 30 years for that ground to get back to the shape it was to sustain life for all these wild insects, birds, and fowl, and everything else.
Protecting the land around us, protecting the soil under us is really our obligation. And from that, we get delicious, nourishing products.
We've been pollinating fruits and vegetables and nuts since the 70s, 60s, 50s. And we haven't had these kind of losses. We're not bad beekeepers, we're just trying to hang on to our business.
Key points from that, because that went really, really quick. They say beehives mostly work until we get in the way of things. When we start putting synthetic things into the beehive, we're screwing up the microbiome of the beehive. We're taking away the bees' ability to fend for themselves. Population of honeybees are dying at unprecedented rates, almost half of them. Well, can you blame them? We're shoving poisons into them. We're feeding them feed that is not, that is sterile in nature, that is not alive. We're trucking them all over the U.S., putting stress on them. Of course they're going to die. We can learn a great deal of bees about the health of our landscapes we inhabit. The more diversity that we have on our property, we can tell why those bees are dying off because there's no food for them, right? when we learn, we can learn a great deal about the folly of setting up our agriculture in the way that we have. Those are things that we're realizing now through these conferences, is that, yes, maybe we've been doing things, maybe we can integrate things that will have a more continuous, living root, a more systems approach-based way of farming. Agriculture is an interruption of a natural system, but it can be done thoughtfully as an interruption of a natural system with great benefits. And that's what we're learning, right? How to integrate different things so that we can interrupt agriculture during the times where we choose to do so, but then allow it to continue. And then protecting the land around us, protecting the soil under us is really our obligation. And from that, we get delicious, nourishing products. I mean, this is what we're all about, and these conferences are all about. So how can we as farmers change the fate of beekeeping? How can we rewrite this story to favor what we are already doing? Well, we need to understand that bees are not dying off in this country, nor all over the world. At least not the wild honeybees, not the feral honeybees that we harness. But they are running low on habitat. The practices that we have, the things that we have learned from the past Dust Bowls and how we reversed, the Dust Bowl that we created with tillage and monocultures, the great federal response of the Prairie States Forestry Project that they replanted shelter belts to harness wind, water, and soil erosion practices to keep that soil back in the ground, to have living roots, perennially. How are we undoing everything our ancestors did for us 90 years ago? These tree rows have done their job, but maybe we haven't done a good job at replanting them. Our solution at looking at tree rows now is like, well, they're dying and they're falling over and they're going into the field, and they've done their thing. Plus, this is a prairie state, like those things shouldn't be even in here. But what are we creating? We're creating, by taking out all these tree rows, we're creating the perfect storm of recreating the Dust Bowl. But there are bees all over this country. Many people don't believe me because they hear all these articles and all these news that bees are dying at alarming rates. But there's natural swarming of feral bees that are in our areas. Every year, you probably know of somebody that says, that has captured a wild swarm, or that a swarm shows up on their porch or on their tree. Every spring, you probably know of somewhere on some homestead or some tree, near a hunting ground that you have, that there's a beehive. And those are the beehives that are going to save this country. Those are the beehives that we want to harness, the beehives that are on our properties. But how can we get them from the tree into a box that we can manage to really harness them? To show you how big of a problem bees are as far as how much they multiply, in large metropolitan areas, there are companies that are bee extermination or bee capturing companies. In large metropolitan areas where bees are unmanaged, where people are keeping bees in their backyard and mismanaging them, these bees are becoming feral, just like hogs are in many parts of the country. There are whole businesses dedicated to capturing these pests. Bees, properly managed, repopulate themselves over and over and over again. They are keystone species that everything eats. Birds, other insects, all sorts of lizards, snakes, raccoons, skunks. Windshields love bees. San Diego has companies that all they do is they remove bees year-round. Los Angeles has all these companies. In 2019, I was actually going to move to Berlin before I really kind of started my company up, because they were paying €47,000 a year plus room and board to be able to move to Berlin if you wanted to be a beekeeper, to be capturing all these wild swarms that were causing problems to businesses that were landing on, in city streets, on taxi cabs, in subways. Bees are a pest when they're allowed to be bees. They will recreate themselves over and over and over again. Third honey. So what can you do? How could you get started? What level of involvement could you do as a farmer now? Let's say you don't want to get into beekeeping now, or let's say you want to get into beekeeping now. There's 3 different ways that you can get involved in at least starting to explore the idea of having honeybees. The first, the least amount of effort, would be to provide habitat. You're already producing cover crops. The only thing you can do to maybe get into the bee business on the, just tippy-toe into the water is add more flowering plants, more plants with color in them. So when you're getting a recommendation for all these plants that you need for your cover crops, ask which one of these will produce color that will produce pollen and nectar. This is how we tippy-toe into the bee business. You're already planting cover crops. Let's see if we can tippy-toe and push, to be able to establish more blooms so we can attract these bees to our places. The second level, this would be like, you've got your gold level, your platinum, and then we're going to get to your diamond level, right? So your second level is we need to put up unmanaged bee boxes, and I'll show you what those look like. And our third level is like the cold plunge, like the John Wayne throwing the kid into the river because he doesn't know how to swim kind of a move, right? He'll figure it out. So this is what the first one looks like. We need to recreate what our ancestors created to stop the Dust Bowl. We need to figure out how to do food forests in the areas where they're not going to disturb our current operations. We need to look at tree rows that we have now, and instead of completely clearing them out, look at which ones bloom in color and maybe leave those and tear out the rest. Does that make sense? Actually manage it, not eradicate the whole system. And what can we replace in their places? We need to understand what's already there. Who knows what the first top one is? Yeah, and how many of you guys hate it and kill it and, and spray it? That's your first application, isn't it, in the spring? As soon as you can get out there that you're not going to get that tractor stuck, you're out there killing it. But that is the first nectar source for wild pollinators and your bees, right? Do we really understand what it does? Can we let it be? Can we wait? This is something that you're going to have to decide. Dandelions. I know every single one of you guys don't have them in your front yards. Well, maybe Gail, you have them. Clovers, right? I just learned, or I was the instigator in Kevin's last class, where he showed a picture of clover inside a stand of his corn, and he says these don't compete; they help each other. And I raised my hand, and I'm like, "Are you suggesting that somebody with a beehive could be feeding their bees nectar in the clover and pollen from the corn?" And he's just like, "Well, yes, I am." I'm like, "Oh, that sounds like 2 crops in one. A honey crop and a corn crop." Right? What's the top one up here? Bradford pear. How many of you guys love Bradford pear trees? None of you, right? But as the first, tree source of nectar. Why do you guys hate it so much? Invasive. Aren't humans invasive? You guys aren't wiping each other out.
It's more the dilemma is that it's taking up space that could otherwise go to native plants. So if it were to be torn out and a Siberian elm grew instead, no good. But if someone were to plant, say, Juneberry,
Okay.
that would be ideal.
So Juneberry is a shrub, but it can coexist with a tree, right? Even though it's invasive, right? So why is something invasive? It's successful, okay? It's successful in the conditions it exists, right? I learned a long time ago many things from a very wise businessman, my father. And he said, if something is working, feed it. But we do the opposite. If something is not working, that's what we put our most resource into it. Yes, it's invasive, but it's only invasive because we don't take the time to manage it, right? It wouldn't be invasive if we just left it alone. The opposite.
Okay.
Just making sure you're listening, right? But does that kind of make sense? If something is invasive, that means it has an advantage of why to be there. If they're already there, instead of, trying to eradicate it, why don't you just place it somewhere where it's going to be out of your way so that in 10 years you're going to be able to feed your bees with no inputs? Food forest or an eyesore? Come on, farmers. You have these in your tree rows. How many people can pick out the species in here? What species, what plant species are here? Poison? Somebody's itchy already just thinking about it, okay? Yeah, pronghorn sumac, okay? That's another flowering plant the bees use. What else? Blackberry. Blackberry, yes. You guys like eating blackberries, you just don't like the thorns. What else? Willow, yes, very good. The willow up top. That's the first huge pollen source for honeybees. What else? Wild grapes. Okay, did you know Kansas in the 50s produced more table grapes than any other state in the Union? What else? What's this one right in here? Close, it's a sandhill plum. Okay, so many of you look at that, and we've got the dogwood's hard to see up there, but when we're looking at these landscapes, at these greenscapes, at these vertical food forests on our land, maybe we haven't torn them out because we don't have enough money or enough favors owed, to our neighbor who has a dozer for us to ask him to take it out, right? But before we tear it out, let's figure out what's there. This right here, you've got 7 different plants that could produce a honey crop for you. But if you were to tear it all out, you have nothing. You're actually negative. Because to make a willow tree and a dogwood tree, it's going to take you 10 years. You go back in time. So this is the perfect time of the year for you to get yourself a 50-cent calendar at Walmart. Next year, if they invite me back, I'm going to bring a whole bunch of them. For you guys to see, whenever you see something flowering, you write down the date you saw it flowering on your property, what color it was, and send me a picture of it. Actually, you can send me a picture of it all this year if you want. And I'll help you identify it, and I'll help you tell you what it is, and I'll help you tell you if it's invasive, but if we can use it or not. If you could send it to me and I'll tell you, it's invasive, do not kill it, get a beehive, right? If it's invasive and I'm like, kill it. If you send me a picture and it's like 180 acres of it and it's bad, I'm going to be like, sell your property, buy your neighbors. Can we recreate this? Can we salvage what you have now? Can I convince you to rethink this? Right? I know some of you are stacking up those favors for your neighbor that has that dozer before you get, enough gumption to ask him to tear it all out. But this is destructive in nature. Not in nature, but, Level 2, we're now to the platinum, beekeeping operation. Keep the soil covered as much as possible. Most of you guys already do a really good job at keeping the soil covered with your main crops, right? You've got your corn, which is great and beneficial for honeybees during tasseling. In fact, they can help increase the number of kernels on all your ears. Bees, in sufficient numbers, can come and help move all this pollen. When we don't have proper winds, well, that never happens in Kansas, during tasseling, or when we don't have enough children to bribe to go out there and help with the tasseling of the corn, we can command our bees to come do it for us. We've got alfalfa. We once were a prominent state producing alfalfa seed. We are no longer that superpower. Soybeans, even though we've genetically modified them to to self-pollinate, the bees can still go in there and disturb and create 1 or 2 extra beans per pod, or help create some of those blooms that that would have aborted to create little spurs. When I ask farmers, how is it that the literature says that one soybean plant can produce 600 to 700 pods, and when we're doing pod counts on excluded areas on soybean fields, we're only counting 47 to 56 pods. What's the system that's broken there? How can a plant truly be, maximizing itself when only 10% of the pods that it could produce are actually turning out to producing? I mean, just think, if you had honeybees to help wake that plant up, what if you could have 100 blooms, 100 pods instead of 56? I mean, it's incredible, doubling your yield out of a potential 700. But we need pollinators. We need boots on the ground. And then cotton. There's a lot more crops that bees benefit, but these are just some examples of our bees working the crops that you're already doing. So this is stuff you're already doing. In our cover cropping, keep the soil plant as much as possible. So in our cover cropping, we're adding all these other things, or all these other things are around. So we've got Coreopsis, right, which is a weed that we see in the ditches. Why is it everywhere? Is it invasive? Yes.
Is it?
We see it everywhere.
It is in low wet areas in the field.
Well, geez, I'd hate wet areas in my fields. I hate all that moisture. Your sunflowers. So your most, some of the best soils on farms I found in ditches. They do all the principles of regenerative, agriculture. They always keep a living root. They always have diversity in crops. They're always the most productive, and they're always the most effort to harvest. They use the most petrol to keep them down. Who knows what this bottom one is? Buttonbush. Very good. Some of the most flavorful honey from a shrub comes from the buttonbush. And then your pronghorn sumac, that's actually pretty tasty as well. We already talked about this part. So the first level is get involved in providing habitat. You're already planting crops. You're already doing cover crops. Can we integrate more trees and shrubs to replenish the trees and shrubs that are dying off in our areas? Our level 2 is provide unmanaged bee boxes. So we could put boxes up in trees to see if we can provide habitat for the bees that are around, to see what is around. So these are boxes that we're not going to actively manage for honey production. But because we don't have time or we don't want to mess with the bees, but we want to provide a habitat box. This would be like putting up a bluebird box or an owl box, to provide habitat for bees to exist so they can pollinate our crops, our cover crops, and our own gardens in our backyard. So this is like level 2. This is no longer like tipping your toe into the pool. This is like sitting next to the pool and putting your feet in, It's still, it's in the middle of winter, but you still want to enjoy the pool a little bit. And then level 3, this is the John Wayne jump into the river, what I'm proposing that you do. Bees and crops. So level 3, if you want to get into beekeeping, we're going to go through some of the different crops that you guys are growing and if they are good or not good for the beekeeping operation aspect of it. In the winter, we have winter wheat. There's no documented benefit for bees or for the crop with wheat. I'm not telling you guys not to plant wheat, but imagine if you could start planting camelina or canola, right? Or maybe turning, instead of doing 1 year in wheat and 1 year in camelina, maybe rotate in a different crop that maybe you could get a honey crop from. Soybeans. We talked briefly about how many pods they can actually have and how many pods they can help you kind of express. Soybeans are being pollinated by honeybees in many parts of the world. There's farmers doing it in Alabama, but in South America, in Australia, honeybees are actively being used to help increase yields of soybeans. Corn. There is no documented benefit to the crop, but I've been telling farmers for 7 years that bees use the corn, and bees are helping increase the yield. None of the literature has ever supported my observations until 2 years ago, when finally universities are like, for some reason, bees are pollinating the corn. We don't know why, but they just are. I'm like, well, yeah, I see them all the time on my corn. In fact, you know, I've had farmers call me and they're like, Jorge, you're not going to believe what I just saw. And I'm like, what are we talking about here? And they're like, corn. I'm like, okay, is your corn tasseling? And like, yeah. But when I was driving by, it looked like a bunch of locusts and grasshoppers just devouring my cornfields. And I freaked out and almost called my crop consultant because I'm like, you didn't tell me about this, like we should have sprayed for these things. And I'm like, let me guess, the honeybees were all over your corn. Like, yeah, when I actually stopped and went to look, these honeybees were just all over my corn, gathering the pollen, helping spread the pollen. But look what we had to help also entice them to come to the corn. They come to get the buckwheat, the nectar from the buckwheat, and the corn and the pollen from the corn. So, even though the experts say that corn is not pollinated by animals, that it's, wind pollinated, you can see here that it's wind pollinated by all the flapping of the wings of the bees. Sunflowers. Most cultivars are self-incompatible, so the pollen must come from another plant. If we're just producing sunflower seed for bird feed or something like that, if we're not going to be paid for the fertility rates of sunflowers, then there's not going to be any test, and you just get a certain price. But if we're selling seed to cover crop companies, and they do test the fertility rate of the sunflower seed, you need honeybees. It doesn't show it here, but a sunflower that is self-pollinated and is not cross-pollinated with another plant, without honeybees or an insect to transfer the pollen, you go from 9% fertility. When you add honeybees, you get up to 93 fertility. So that's a big, price difference as far as what you're going to get paid for sunflowers. As you can see, all these bees are working all that sunflower pollen. Cotton. The cotton is self-pollinated, uses about half the flowers that produce mature bolls. Between 225 and 400 bolls are usually required to produce a pound of fruit. So if the quicker that the honeybees can get into the cotton plant to help this plant pollinate itself, the quicker the plant can move on to developing more bolls to open up the following days. So, and cotton honey is probably the best tasting honey out of all the crops that we can produce. It's phenomenal. Canola for seed. I went to an event 3 months ago where Scholar and KU put on together that they are opening up a oilseed plant in Goodland. They're supposed to be in operation like June or July of this year, and they were offering contracts to people growing canola. They're wanting in the next 10 years to be able to have 400,000 acres in Kansas to be able to produce seed oil for refineries. That's their 10-year goal. So they're trying to sign up as many farmers, to grow canola. Me being the troublemaker in the group and not a farmer and a beekeeper, I wanted to hear, what the impact of this was going to be on honeybee, colony growth in Kansas. So I raised my hand at the end of the presentation. I asked the head KU canola guru, I said, in all your tests that you've done in the last 11 years on developing canola seed for Kansas, how many of these tests included adding beehives? And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, well, canola is pollinated by honeybees. And they said, oh, right now it is. But all the seed that we're developing with Bayer is not going to require any of your honeybees. So that's not even part of the equation. And I said, game on. Just so you know, the summer canola is produced in North and South Dakota. There's half of the close to 3 million commercially kept beehives in the United States. 500,000 of those hives are contracted to North and South Dakota at $50 a hive. So a producer will pay a beekeeper $50 a hive for them to come put bees on the canola fields so that they can get, higher seed and higher weight and oil in the seed. So canola is still, the ones that are available now, is still pollinated by bees. We talked about, here's buckwheat, alfalfa for seed. We already talked about that. So where do we start with honeybees? Kind of like, let's see here, I got 10 minutes to go. First, we talked about evaluating your habitat, and I can help you with that. Send me pictures and I can help you evaluate that. Or invite me to your place as things are starting to bloom. 2, locate bee populations. The best way we do that is by putting up boxes, just like you would put up bird boxes, in expecting of the migratory birds. As all you guys put up your little gourds and stuff like that, same time we should be putting up these boxes to see if bees will move into them. Monitor the bees during our farming operations. When we're out and about, if you see pictures on any of your crops, you send them to me and you go, hey, they're here, come get them, right? We'll come put up boxes to see if they can have them move in. And decide your level of involvement. So what does each one of these look like? We already talked about evaluating your habitat. We already talked about putting up, these bee boxes that are going to be up and out of your way so that you don't have to mess with them, but you have these animals, insects as resources for you. Monitor for bees. Most of you either know of where there are feral bees or know somebody that knows where some bees are. Maybe you have people that are, that hire your place for hunting and they tell you, they come back and find other things that we can do. Hopefully bees are in your future and they can become an umbrella for you to help your land flourish. Thank you very much.
Story on the honey types.
Oh, yes. Okay. Which honey did you guys taste, or how many of you preferred the taste of honey A? How many of you preferred the taste of honey B? How many of you preferred the taste of honey C? Okay. Well, honey A is the worldwide honey. That honey, as you tasted it, was maybe a little, a little not harsh at the beginning, but you could definitely taste something in the beginning and then kind of smoothed out. So that honey that comes from all over the world, many of these places maybe don't have access to as much sugar syrup, right? So it's not like as astringent as like maybe bee that you tasted that was like really in your face. So I think like the second honey would be like when you're really, really thirsty and it's hot out and you go and open up a cold soda pop and you drink it. That first drink is just like, whoa, like it just jolts you, right? But then as you drink more and more of that soda, your body's like, okay, you tricked me the first time, now I'm prepared for all this sucrose that's coming. So the honey A is more level, it doesn't have as much sucrose in it because there are many countries like Poland, who have to pay high import tax of sugar syrup, of sugar. So they might not be feeding their bees as much sugar. So it's maybe less sugar. But something like somewhere like Poland has access to more chemicals because a lot of these chemicals are produced in Russia. So it might be more, it might have more kind of chemical taste, more medicine kind of a taste. The U.S. honey is probably the most like bold in your face and maybe astringent as you first taste it, because here we have access to cheap sugar and cheap-ish, where availability of chemicals is very, very readily available. So that honey is a lot more, kind of astringent because it contains those things that are put in like what we saw. And honey C is our honey, which has no inputs whatsoever. Most of the time when people have it after the other two, they just go, well, that one's a little different. Like there's something different about it. Maybe it's more smooth, maybe it's not as like sweet, like bittersweet, if that kind of makes sense. So the difference between the first and the second and the third honey would be like when you drink milk, from a jug that's pasteurized, comes from cows that are, vaccinated and fed, a certain regime of food, you can taste that kind of in the milk. If you taste it against milk that comes from a farm, from cows, directly from the farm. So our honey is more like the milk that comes from a farm that you can buy every day, that's fresh, that's alive, that has microbiotics and things like that. The other two honeys are not necessarily just more processed, but they have inputs that express themselves in the output, if that kind of makes sense. So, other questions?
Do bees get a virus and die?
Yes, just like plants and just like humans. So, can bees, the bees are more susceptible to viruses when they're fed not whole foods, if that makes sense. So if us as farmers can provide whole foods to bees, their immune systems are going to be higher. So if we're taking away as a commercial beekeeper all the nectar and pollen that they gather during the spring and honey, and we replaced it with sugar syrup and those yeast and pollen substitutes, it'd be like what we talked about. We would survive off of just Hershey bars. But by the time we want them to work in the next spring, they're going to be decimated in health. I tell people, I don't smoke cigars or anything like that, but somebody was talking to me about cigars, and I said, well, if you and I went and smoked a cigar right now, we would probably be fine. Our bodies would probably be like, what was that all about tomorrow? But we would make it. Now, if I had diabetes and asthma and I had a weakened immune system, and we went and smoked a cigar, I would feel a lot more than you if you were a healthy person. So anything that is weakened, whether it's a plant, an animal, or a bee, because of the inputs that we feed it, when we see disease and pressure, it's going to atrophy much faster. So we find that our bees are more resilient to these things. And the bees that we're capturing, and we can capture them because they're not a native species, they are already living on their own. So these bees are not being fed sugar syrup, so they have to forage for themselves. They already know if they're from your area, they already know your planting rotation actually. So they already know when to build up. They already know when you're cleaning your cedar and filling your cedar, and you're like, oh, in 45 days we're gonna have soybeans. They already know. The soil knows even. If you think your soil doesn't know your crop rotation, we've got a lot of learning to do. So the land knows what you're going to do based on your initial actions. When you start mowing the beginning of your lawn, the end of your lawn has already protected itself, from the blades that are coming. There's that much communication. Same thing with the beehives. So the bees that we're capturing, that we're providing homes for, are already used to the chemicals that you guys are spraying. They're already resistant to these things. They're already figured out the pest pressure and which ones are going to survive. A good question.
How much honey do you have to leave in the hives to be able to save for the winter?
The bees will take care of that. So when we don't put inputs into the hive, the way my hives are designed, they're designed kind of horizontally. And what the bees do is they take up the first 2/3 of the box, and this is where they live. Anything in excess is like their garage, or really kind of like their storage unit. And everything they're not going to use for that winter is going to be put in the back. And that's the honey that we take in the back. The traditional honey systems are stacked vertically, so it's the same thing. The bees are going to be at the bottom, and all the excess is going to be at the top. The problem with that system that I used to run is I have to unstack the whole thing. In the design that we have now, everything is vertical on one level, and all we're doing is removing anything that's excess in the back. All the honey that they're going to need, they're going to put around all of their brood to be used as insulation for the winter. And I'm 6 for 6 years on reading what the bees are going to say about what the winter's going to be. I'm 5 for 6 years on guessing within 2 or 3 days of when the first frost date is on properties where we've had bees for 2 or 3 years.
So are we gonna get a lot of rain this summer?
I'll tell you in the spring. Call me on March 17th and I'll let you know when we open the hives.
He called the snow that we just had, so.
I told him in July. Yeah. The bees can actually see, looking at my records of like how the bees did at the end of the year, throughout the year, and what the bees were forecasting at the beginning of the year. The bees can actually read our perennial trees, shrubs, and perennial grasses in the ditches, which have much better information than what we have. So looking back, somehow the bees were able to read all the precursors of these perennial trees, shrubs, and annuals, or not annuals, but flowering plants, 9 months ahead of time. I can only give you a pretty accurate 6-week forecast because I can look at the reproductive cycle of a bee, of a queen bee, what she's doing, and she will only lay eggs to produce a working bee 6 weeks ahead of time if it knows there's going to be blooms enough for it to work. So within 6 weeks, I'll know when we're going to have rain based on that very localized bee that has lived in your place, if that makes sense.
And if there's gonna be rain,
Within a 45-day period, so you have blooms at 6 weeks.
so she'll start producing, like, more of her
Yeah,
babies.
absolutely. She'll start laying a lot more eggs. And I can predict whether there's going to be, well, the bees can predict. So 2 years ago, the first week of May, I started calling all the producers that work with me, and I said, all the bees in all these counties are starting to pull back, and it's going to be really dry June and July, and we're not going to have any rain. And the people that really kind of believe in kind of what we're doing, some of them are like, well, we were thinking about pushing this crop, but if you think that's going to happen, let's just wait till next season to try that experiment. I had people on the other side of the aisle that are like, are you sure it's going to be really dry? I'm like, well, this is what the bees are saying. And he went and planted extra stuff that he normally wouldn't have, and got insurance on it. So you can play both sides of the coin. With information, with insider information, you know, you can do many, many things. Any other questions? Thank you very much for having me.